Modesto, California, in 2002 was the quintessential American small-town /U2014 place where neighbors knew each other, streets were lined with manicured lawns, and the air was filled with a comforting sense of community. Nestled within this idyllic setting was Laci Peterson, a woman who embodied the optimism and warmth of her surroundings. At 27 years old, Laci was vibrant, radiantly beautiful, and just weeks away from becoming a mother. Her life seemed like a dream come true. Married to Scott Peterson, a charismatic fertilizer salesman, Laci /U2019's days were filled with preparing for the arrival of their son, whom they had already named Conner. Together, Laci and Scott appeared to be the epitome of a perfect couple. Their picturesque home was a symbol of their love and ambition. Friends described Laci as kind, nurturing, and full of life, while Scott was considered charming and dependable. But behind closed doors, the pressures of impending parenthood and hidden secrets were quietly eroding their seemingly unshakable bond. As Christmas approached, Laci immersed herself in holiday preparations. She decorated their home meticulously, hosted gatherings with friends and family, and looked forward to a future filled with new beginnings. However, those closest to her noticed subtle changes. Laci seemed more stressed than usual, a departure from her typically cheerful demeanor. She attributed it to pregnancy fatigue, but in hindsight, those around her wondered if she had sensed something was amiss. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Christmas Eve, Laci /U2019's routine began like any other. She was seen walking their golden retriever, Mackenzie, around the neighborhood. It was a habit she rarely deviated from. However, by afternoon, her carefully structured world unraveled. Scott claimed to have returned home to find Mackenzie wandering in their front yard, leash still attached. There was no sign of Laci. Alarmed but composed, Scott contacted Laci /U2019's mother, Sharon Rocha, to inform her that Laci was missing. Sharon /U2019's immediate reaction was one of panic. Laci /U2019's family knew her habits and character well. She would never abandon her dog or leave without notifying someone. Within hours, friends and family mobilized a search effort, scouring nearby parks, streets, and wooded areas. Meanwhile, Scott reported Laci /U2019's disappearance to the police, initiating an investigation that would soon captivate the nation. In the days that followed, Modesto became a hub of activity. Volunteers blanketed the city with flyers bearing Laci /U2019's smiling face. Candlelight vigils were held, prayers were whispered, and a growing sense of unease settled over the community. The media descended upon Modesto, broadcasting updates on the search and turning Laci /U2019's story into a national obsession. Her disappearance struck a chord with millions, many of whom felt a personal connection to the glowing mother-to-be. Yet amid the collective grief and urgency, Scott /U2019's behavior stood out. While Sharon and Laci /U2019's siblings openly wept during press conferences, Scott appeared detached, even aloof. His responses to questions were measured and unemotional, a stark contrast to the anguish of those around him. He described his activities on Christmas Eve /U2014 a solo fishing trip to Berkeley Marina /U2014 with an unsettling level of nonchalance. Detectives began to notice inconsistencies in Scott /U2019's account. He claimed to have been fishing for sturgeon, a detail that raised eyebrows given the season and his inexperience with the sport. His explanation for leaving his 8-month pregnant wife alone on Christmas Eve was met with skepticism. The calm demeanor he maintained in interviews only fueled suspicions. To the public, Scott seemed more concerned with his image than finding his wife. Then, just as the investigation gained momentum, a revelation shattered the carefully crafted image of the Petersons' /U2019 marriage. Scott had been having an affair. His mistress, Amber Fry, came forward after learning about Laci/U 2019's disappearance. A single mother and massage therapist from Fresno, Amber had been led to believe Scott was unmarried. Outraged and heartbroken, she cooperated with law enforcement, providing recordings of phone calls that exposed Scott/U 2019's duplicity. In these recordings, Scott spoke of traveling abroad and starting fresh. Most chilling was a call made on December 31st, during a New Year/U 2019 SE vigil for Laci. As mourners gathered in Modesto to light candles and pray for her safe return, Scott phoned Amber, claiming to be in Paris. The juxtaposition of his deception with the community/U 2019's collective grief was staggering. Public opinion began to shift. While Scott had initially garnered sympathy as a grieving husband, his actions painted a different picture. The revelation of his affair, combined with his peculiar behavior, cast him in a new light. The once loving husband now seemed like a man with something to hide. As weeks turned into months, hope of finding Laci alive began to fade. Despite extensive search efforts, no significant leads emerged. Then, in April 2003, the case took a grim turn. A couple walking along the San Francisco Bay shoreline discovered a decomposed torso. Days later, the remains of a baby were found nearby. DNA testing confirmed the worst. The bodies belonged to Laci and Conner. The discovery was a turning point. For investigators, it provided the evidence needed to build a case against Scott. For Laci/U 2019's family, it was a devastating end to months of uncertainty. And for the public, it marked the beginning of a quest for justice. As the investigation progressed, more details about Scott/U 2019's actions came to light. His purchase of a boat just weeks before Laci/U 2019's disappearance, his internet searches for tides in the San Francisco Bay, and the discovery of concrete residue in his storage unit painted a harrowing picture of premeditation. The question now was not whether Scott was involved, but how he had managed to hide his darkness for so long. The stage was set for a trial that would grip the nation. The once perfect life Scott had built was now in ruins, and the community/U 2019's focus shifted to ensuring Laci/U 2019's story would not end in vain. The discovery of Laci and Conner's remains in the San Francisco Bay was a devastating blow to her family and community. Yet, it marked a turning point in the case, shifting the focus from a desperate search to a relentless pursuit of justice. With Laci's fate tragically confirmed, investigators honed in on their primary suspect, Scott Peterson. The puzzle pieces of his behavior, actions, and lies began to fit together in a chilling picture of betrayal and premeditation. From the outset, Scott's behavior had been puzzling. While most grieving spouses retreat into mourning, Scott appeared outwardly unshaken. In the weeks following Laci's disappearance, he displayed actions that seemed callous at best and incriminating at worst. He sold her car, discussed putting their house on the market, and even inquired about selling furniture. To those closest to Laci, these actions felt like an attempt to erase her existence, not preserve her memory. The revelation of Scott's affair with Amber Fry added a damning layer to the narrative. Amber, a single mother from Fresno, had no idea that Scott was married when their relationship began. But as Laci's disappearance dominated national headlines, Amber grew suspicious and eventually contacted law enforcement. Her decision to cooperate was courageous, and her involvement became a turning point in the case. Amber recorded hours of phone conversations with Scott, during which he spun elaborate lies about his whereabouts and future plans. He spoke of traveling to Europe, described dreams of a new life, and made chillingly detached remarks about his past life. One of the most infamous moments came during a New Year's Eve vigil held for Laci. While the Modesto community gathered to honor her memory, Scott was on the phone with Amber, claiming he was in Paris. The background noise of mourners could be heard faintly during the call, a stark reminder of the duplicity he maintained. To the public, Scott's behavior was more than suspicious. It was damning. How could a man so detached from the gravity of his wife's disappearance be anything but guilty? As Amber's recordings were analyzed, investigators began to piece together a timeline that cast Scott in an increasingly sinister light. His alibi, fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina on Christmas Eve, raised more questions than answers. Why would a man whose wife was 8 months pregnant choose such an unusual activity on a holiday morning? Moreover, why had Scott purchased a small boat just weeks earlier, despite having no prior interest in boating? These questions loomed large as detectives scrutinized every detail of his story. Forensic evidence began to fill in the gaps. Investigators found traces of concrete dust in Scott's storage unit, suggesting he had crafted homemade anchors. These anchors, they believed, were used to weigh down Laci's body in the bay. Although the anchors themselves were missing, the residue was a chilling indication of premeditation. Even more haunting was the discovery of a single strand of hair, later confirmed to belong to Laci, tangled in a pair of pliers on Scott's boat. This small but significant detail tied Scott directly to the crime scene. As the case against Scott solidified, public opinion shifted dramatically. News outlets dissected every aspect of his life, from his marriage to his demeanor. While some initially sympathized with him as a grieving husband, the growing mountain of evidence painted a different picture. Scott was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a man who had carefully plotted to rid himself of his wife and unborn child. The motive, prosecutors argued, was as old as it was cold: freedom. Scott had grown weary of the responsibilities of marriage and impending fatherhood. He saw Laci and Conner not as a family to cherish, but as obstacles to a carefree life. Divorce, however, was not an option. It would tarnish the perfect image he projected. Instead, Scott chose the unthinkable. He meticulously planned their murders, believing he could start fresh without the burdens he resented. Amber Frey's testimony became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. In court, she recounted her interactions with Scott in painstaking detail. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion as she described the man she once trusted. The recordings she provided offered a chilling insight into Scott's psyche, revealing a man capable of astonishing deceit. Amber's courage in confronting the truth and standing up for Laci was widely lauded, and her testimony left a lasting impression on the jury. The media frenzy surrounding the case intensified as more evidence came to light. Investigators revealed Scott's internet search history, which included inquiries about tidal patterns in the San Francisco Bay. They also noted his repeated visits to the marina in the weeks leading up to Laci's disappearance. These trips, they argued, were not innocent outings but reconnaissance missions. Scott was scouting locations to dispose of his wife's body, confident that the water would conceal his crime. Public outrage reached a boiling point as these details emerged. Protesters gathered outside the courtroom, holding signs demanding justice for Laci and Conner. The case had transcended its local roots, becoming a national symbol of betrayal and the darker side of human nature. Scott Peterson, once the golden boy of Modesto, was now the most reviled man in America. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Scott maintained his innocence. His defense team argued that the case against him was circumstantial, lacking the direct proof needed for a conviction. They suggested that Laci had been the victim of a random act of violence, perhaps an abduction or a robbery gone wrong. But the prosecution's narrative was airtight, woven together with forensic science, witness testimonies, and Scott's own actions. The climax of the investigation came when GPS data from Scott's boat revealed his repeated visits to specific locations in the bay. Combined with the timeline of Laci's disappearance and the discovery of her remains, these findings were irrefutable. The prosecution's case was clear. Scott Peterson had planned and executed the murder of his wife and unborn child with chilling precision. By the time the trial began in 2004, the evidence against Scott was insurmountable. Witnesses testified, experts analyzed forensic findings, and Amber Frey's recordings echoed through the courtroom. Each detail built upon the last, creating a narrative that left little room for doubt. The man who had once appeared composed and confident now sat silently, his mask slipping further with every revelation. The stage was set for a dramatic verdict, one that would determine the fate of the man accused of one of the most notorious crimes in American history. The nation held its breath, waiting to see if justice for Laci and Conner would be served. The trial of Scott Peterson began in 2004, capturing the nation's attention and cementing itself as one of the most sensational murder trials in American history. Every detail of the case, from the courtroom proceedings to the emotional testimonies, was broadcast on national television. The stakes were high. Justice for Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Conner, depended on the ability of prosecutors to convince the jury of Scott's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution's strategy was meticulously crafted. They pieced together a narrative of premeditated murder, presenting evidence that painted Scott as a cold and calculating man who viewed his family as obstacles to his freedom. At the heart of their case was the timeline of Laci's disappearance, Scott's suspicious behavior, and the forensic evidence that tied him to the crime. The recordings provided by Amber Frey were among the most damning pieces of evidence. Played in court, these phone calls showcased Scott's unflinching ability to lie and manipulate. In one call, Scott spoke to Amber about a future where he was unencumbered by the responsibilities of fatherhood, describing trips he planned to take and the freedom he anticipated. His calm, conversational tone was chilling when juxtaposed with the reality that Laci and Conner were missing, and, by this point, deceased. Amber's testimony was equally compelling. Taking the stand, she described her relationship with Scott in excruciating detail, recounting the lies he told and the promises he made. Her voice, steady but tinged with emotion, carried the weight of betrayal. She explained how she had cooperated with law enforcement, even as she grappled with the horrifying realization that the man she had been dating was at the center of a murder investigation. Her courage earned her admiration, and her words left an indelible impression on the jury. The forensic evidence was the backbone of the prosecution's case. Expert witnesses detailed the significance of the concrete residue found in Scott's storage unit, explaining how it indicated the creation of makeshift anchors. These anchors, they argued, were used to weigh down Laci's body in the San Francisco Bay. Though the anchors themselves were never recovered, their absence was damning. Additionally, GPS data from Scott's boat revealed his frequent visits to the bay in the weeks leading up to Laci's disappearance, further supporting the theory of premeditation. The discovery of Laci and Conner's remains was another critical point. Forensic experts testified about the state of the bodies, explaining how the currents in the bay had likely dislodged them from their original resting place. While the defense argued that the lack of direct evidence linking Scott to the remains created reasonable doubt, the prosecution countered with a cohesive timeline that left little room for alternative explanations. The emotional core of the trial came from Laci's family. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, delivered a heart-wrenching testimony that brought the courtroom to tears. Through sobs, she described the joy Laci brought to their lives and the unbearable pain of losing both her daughter and grandson. Her words were not just a plea for justice, but a reminder of the human cost of Scott's actions. The jury, visibly moved, listened intently as Sharon painted a picture of a vibrant young woman whose life was cut short by an act of unspeakable cruelty. The defense team faced an uphill battle. Their argument hinged on the notion that the case against Scott was circumstantial. They suggested that Laci had been abducted by strangers, perhaps during her morning walk. They pointed to the lack of direct eyewitnesses and argued that the prosecution's narrative relied too heavily on inference. But the jury seemed unconvinced. The mountain of evidence, combined with Scott's suspicious behavior, painted a picture that was difficult to dispute. After months of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional appeals, the jury began their deliberations. The nation waited with bated breath as news outlets dissected every aspect of the trial. Public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of Scott's guilt, but the final decision rested in the hands of the jurors. On November 12, 2004, the verdict was delivered. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci and second-degree murder for the death of Conner. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Laci's family wept openly, their grief mingled with relief. For them, the verdict was a step toward closure, a validation of their relentless fight for justice. Scott's sentencing phase followed shortly after. The jury recommended the death penalty, a decision that reflected the severity of his crimes. The judge upheld their recommendation, sentencing Scott to death by lethal injection. While California's death penalty system meant that his execution was unlikely to occur anytime soon, the sentence sent a powerful message: justice had been served. In the years that followed, Scott's legal team filed numerous appeals, arguing that media coverage and public bias had influenced the trial. Despite these efforts, the original verdict and sentence were upheld. For Laci's family, the appeals process was a painful reminder of the tragedy they had endured. Yet they remained steadfast, dedicating themselves to preserving Laci's memory and advocating for victims of domestic violence. The legacy of Laci Peterson extended far beyond the courtroom. Her case became a catalyst for discussions about the warning signs of domestic violence and the importance of supporting victims. Advocacy groups used her story to raise awareness, emphasizing the need for vigilance in recognizing and addressing abusive relationships. For many, Laci's memory became a symbol of resilience and hope, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, justice can prevail. The murder of Laci Peterson remains one of the most haunting and heartbreaking cases in American history. It exposed the darkness that can lurk behind the facade of a seemingly perfect life and highlighted the importance of community, determination, and the pursuit of truth. As we reflect on this tragedy, let us honor Laci and Conner by remaining vigilant, supporting those in need, and ensuring that their story inspires change. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence or feels unsafe in their relationship, please reach out to trusted resources and support networks. Organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline are available 24/7 to provide help and guidance. By speaking out and supporting one another, we can work together to prevent tragedies like Laci's and create a safer world for everyone.